The Falcon 9 had lifted countless satellites, ferried cargo, and delivered astronauts into orbit, yet when it stood upon its launch pad this time, gleaming beneath the floodlights as if it had been polished for history itself, there was an undercurrent of tension unlike any before, because this was not merely another mission of logistics or commerce, it was the culmination of years of whispered investigations. Anomalies buried deep within classified transmissions from Mars that hinted at a truth too disquieting to ignore, and so as its Merlin engines ignited and the ground shook with thunder, the rocket surged skyward, its body cutting through the atmosphere like a spear of light, and though the world watching believed it was carrying another scientific payload meant to orbit Mars and test the endurance of new instruments, only a handful of those in the know understood the true objective. Falcon 9 had been modified. Equipped with sensors of extraordinary sensitivity, cameras designed to pierce through storms, and spectral imagers that could detect movements imperceptible to the human eye. Because for decades, across countless missions, strange shadows had been recorded upon the Martian surface, shadows that shifted against the light source of the sun in ways no geological feature should, shadows that appeared, stretched, and vanished with a precision that suggested not randomness but intention. And yet every time they were caught on film or in radar scans, they were catalogued and dismissed, classified under the labels of dust, distortion, or camera malfunction, but the whispers never ceased. Scientists confiding in one another about silhouettes that seemed humanoid, towers of darkness that moved across the dunes, or vast wings of shadow stretching across canyons too deep for wind to explain. And now Falcon 9's secret mission was to see what lingered behind those whispers, to prove or disprove what so many had denied. And as the rocket reached orbit, its second stage ignited, sending the payload on a trajectory that would sling it across millions of miles toward the red planet, the Earth shrinking behind into a fragile sphere while ahead Mars glowed like a coal burning in the void. And as days turned to weeks, instruments activated early, catching signals even before arrival, low-frequency pulses that matched no known cosmic source, pulses that grew stronger the closer they came to Mars, as if the planet itself were aware of their approach, calling to them or warning them away. And then, as Falcon 9's payload unfurled its arrays and locked its cameras onto the Martian surface, the first images arrived, sweeping vistas of rust-colored plains and jagged mountains glowing in the pale light, and within them, shadows, not simple streaks of darkness but shapes that stretched against the logic of geometry, angles where there should be none, outlines of structures that dissolved when stared at too long, as though the very act of observation unraveled them, and deeper still, movement, vast blotches of darkness sliding across the terrain without wind, without cause, shifting like living things against the sands. And though the official mission logs would later mark these anomalies as artifacts of data compression, those who sat in the control room that night knew better, for they saw with their own eyes the shadows bending around mountains, slipping into craters, emerging again miles away, as though traversing the surface in patterns too deliberate to be coincidence. And then came the moment no one could explain, when one of the shadows turned, not with the planet's rotation or the sweep of light, but as if acknowledging the camera itself, aligning directly with the lens, stretching longer, darker, deeper, until the image filled with black, and for a breathless instant, those watching felt as though something had looked back across millions of miles, had noticed their gaze and chosen to answer. And though the feed resumed seconds later, the data bore marks of interference unlike any ever recorded, signals woven into the static like coded messages, pulses matching the rhythm of a heartbeat, and the room fell silent. For in that moment everyone understood that Mars was not merely a landscape to be mapped or mined, it was a stage upon which shadows moved, patient and deliberate, waiting for humanity to draw closer. And now that Falcon 9 had looked upon them, the question was not whether shadows existed on the red planet, but whether humanity was ready for what stepped behind them. When the feed resumed and those fractured pulses still throbbed in the data streams like the faint but undeniable echo of a living heartbeat, the men and women seated in the control room realized that whatever they had glimpsed in the black expanse of that Martian transmission was not a glitch, not a trick of photons or the noise of interference, but something intentional, something aware. And though the official words spoken aloud were clipped, cautious, deliberately clinical, the silence beneath them was filled with terror and awe, because for the first time humanity had looked not merely at Mars but into it, into the void behind its dust and rock, into a place where shadows moved as if they possessed volition, where darkness was not absence but presence, and the scientists knew, with the inevitability of doom creeping through their veins, that the boundary between observation and contact had been crossed, that something had looked back. And so as Falcon 9's payload continued its orbit, cameras refocusing, arrays stretching like mechanical pedals to drink in every wavelength of energy, the images came faster, each one stranger than the last, and together they wove a narrative no one wanted to accept, for they showed shadows clustering near Valles Marineris as if gathering in some ritual across the canyon floor, their outlines bending and stretching in unison like a choreography, performed for no audience but the stars. And then near Olympus Mons, the tallest mountain in the solar system, the sensors detected fluctuations in the magnetic field that rippled outward in concentric waves, each pulse matched by the shadows lengthening and shrinking as though responding to a rhythm too vast and ancient for human minds to grasp. And across the plains of Elysium, the dust itself seemed to rise and fall in sync with those pulses, grains of red lifted into spirals that hung in the thin air before collapsing again into silence. But within those spirals, captured only in the frames slowed down and magnified beyond natural motion, forms could be seen, fleeting and translucent, like skeletal structures half-formed, like beings woven not of matter but of absence, patterns of absence that arranged themselves as though they were experimenting with shape. And as these transmissions poured into Earth's data vaults, the control room grew heavy with a knowledge too dangerous to release, so the feeds that reached the public were carefully edited, shadows erased, anomalies blurred, explained away as cosmic radiation or sensor degradation, while behind locked doors the uncut streams were replayed again and again by eyes hollowed with sleepless obsession, because what they showed was not just shadows behaving strangely, it was shadows behaving like intelligence, like watchers, like custodians of a world that had long ago chosen silence as its veil. And though the mission had been designed to probe, to listen, to pierce through the veil of Martian mystery, those aboard the Falcon 9 payload now found themselves wondering if they had instead trespassed, if the very act of looking had torn open a door that had been closed for reasons beyond comprehension. And the more the instruments recorded, the more the pulse patterns aligned with recognizable structures, with rhythms that resembled language, rising tones, falling tones, repeating cycles like chants whispered across a vacuum, chants so steady and so ancient that even the AI designed to filter noise flagged them as non-random, as linguistic, and when decoded into visual form, the patterns resembled vast geometries, maps of lines and arcs that spread across the surface of Mars, geometries that corresponded with the placement of craters and mountains. As though the entire planet had been sculpted not by geology alone but by design, a design orchestrated in shadow, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day eyes dared to see it. And so the whispers began, not among the public but among those few confined to the black-walled briefing rooms, whispers of a civilization that had never died but had simply stepped sideways into silence, becoming the custodians of darkness, existing not as bodies of flesh but as entities of absence, using storms as their cloaks, shadows as their speech, silence as their fortress. And now, as Falcon 9's cameras strained against the static of Mars's dust-choked horizon, those entities stirred, watching humanity's intrusion, marking their presence, responding not with words but with gestures and shadow, with movements synchronized across miles of terrain, as if saying, "You have knocked upon the door, and we have heard, and now the question is not whether you can enter but whether you can endure what lies inside." And the crew who monitored these transmissions could not shake the sense that Mars was no longer a destination of exploration but a stage of confrontation. A place where light itself bent into messages, where the dust storms rose not by chance but by command, where every grain of silence was another syllable in a language older than Earth itself, and with every orbit, every signal, every flicker of shadow against crimson ground, the truth pressed heavier upon them, that humanity had not discovered Mars at all, Mars had revealed itself.